It's time for us to start adding functionality and make this more of a game. I'm going to quickly just delete some of these because, there's a couple too many. I'm also going to drag in the flippers. And remember that when you drag in the right flipper, to click over here and click right, and not just rotate it. I'm just going to set these apart. That looks like a pretty good space for pinball. And it would probably be a good idea for me to go geometry. I'm going to drag in a box. And I'm just going to go ahead and set this up. No, actually, bring back to there. Bring you up to here. And then I'm just going to set these up as a quick downward angle so that if any ball hits the sides, it kind of rolls down into ours, which is okay. I'm going to click on that. I'm going to alt drag it across. And then I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to transform and I'm going to mirror it on the x-axis, which will make it identical but flipped. And that means that all of this can be correctly aligned as well. Tempted to pull these 50 units in just as a stickler. Again, okay, geometry mode. I'm going to click on these 2 points. I'm going to move them 50 units in as well. Okay, so we have ourselves a workable playing field that we can use. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an extra flipper that's up here. One of those common things that you do get in pinball is that quite often you actually have 2 flippers being bound to a single button. So when I click left flipper, both of these would fire. Now, we have a few things that we need to do from here on in. We need to create a player controller that will detect the flippers and then move them when buttons are pressed. We also need to tell the game that the player controller that we've created is the player controller that we should be using by default. Finally, we need to set up some inputs that will bind the buttons correctly to left flipper and right flipper. So I'm going to start by creating a player controller. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a new blueprint. And it's going to be a player controller blueprint. I'm going to call this pinball player controller. I'm going to double click on it. Now that it's open, we're going to have to do a few things. First off, we need to create a function or an event that's going to go out and detect all of the flippers that are currently in the map. Once it's done that, we want it to break it into 2 buckets. We want to have left flippers and right flippers. So this will be 2 arrays that we're going to be creating that will be essentially lists of flippers. So to do this, I'm going to right click and create a custom event. This custom event is going to be called detect flippers. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag off of it and type in get actors of class. Essentially what get actors of class does is it goes through the world and looks for anything that is a specific class. So if I say get all flippers, it's going to return a list of flippers. Now in this situation, what we want to do is for each loop, which means go through the list and for every item in this list, run the function off of loop body. When it's done, run the completed pin. So it keeps firing up here until it's gone through every flipper and then it will fire down here. So in this situation, what I want to do is I want to, for each of these, I want to look at the flipper and I want to check the flip type. So I'm going to get the flip type and I'm going to do a switch. So essentially I'm going to, for every element in the list, look if it's a left flipper or a right flipper. Now if it's a left flipper, what we're going to be doing is creating an array of left flippers and adding it. If it's a right flippers. So the nicest way for me to do this is going to go variable. I'm going to call this variable left flippers. I'm then going to type in the word flipper, and if it's blue, then it's correctly set up as a list of flipper references. However, what we want to do is click on this little button here to turn it into an array of left flippers. I'm now going to duplicate that and call this right flippers. And all I need to do is, if it's a left flipper, get the array and add to the array. Now don't forget when doing this that to add something to an array, it doesn't just add anything. You need to actually connect this to the array element that's being read. So I'm just going to make this a little bit neater. So that add node is now adding this current array element that we're looking at to the left flippers array. At which point I want to do the same thing for the right flippers. So connect that, oops, and I'm going to drag this in and connect that too. So now I have left flippers and right flippers getting read in. So now we've got all of the flippers being stored. The next step is for us to actually create inputs for these. So I'm going to go to my project settings by going Edit, Project Settings, and I'm going to go to Input. I'm going to click here to add an action mapping, and the action mapping that I'm going to add is called left flipper, and it's going to be bound to left control. Left flipper, left control. I'm going to add a new one called right flipper, and it's going to be bound to right control. Oops, CTRL. So we now have two keys that we can use on the keyboard for left and right flipper. I'm going to go back to my player controller, and if I right click and type in left flipper, you can now see that there's an action event that exists for left flipper, which is the input action for left flipper. And all we want this to do is when someone presses the left flipper button, we look at our list of flippers. We do a for loop on them, so for each. And all we say is we want every flipper to flip. And if they release it, we want to do the same thing, so I'm going to hit Control W and duplicate. Except instead of flipping, we want to call the flop function that we created. Now, this looks like it would work right now, however we're missing a very important step. This is very easy to miss. I'm going to hit compile and save. I need to actually create a game mode and set this as the default player controller of that game mode. So I'm going to go back to Pinball, I'm going to go to my Blueprints folder, and I'm going to right click and create another blueprint class that's based on the game mode base. Now the game mode base is where we do all of the game mode instructions. So this is where you would do things such as calculating overall team scores, for instance. Or in this situation, what we're going to be doing is telling it that if they're playing this type of game, make sure they're using a pinball player controller. So I'm going to call this pinball game mode. And I'm going to open it up and go to the event graph. Now, if I look at this, I can see on the right-hand side that by default, it has a whole bunch of different classes that the game mode knows should exist, and they're all set to the defaults. However, I don't want the defaults. I want to set the player controller class to be a pinball player controller. I'm going to compile and save it, and then within my project settings, I'm going to go to Maps and Modes, and I'm going to tell it to use the pinball game mode. Now, upon doing so, there's really only one thing that we have left to do. I'm going to go back to Pinball, and I'm going to open up my player controller, and that function that we created before, detect flippers, I'm going to tell it in begin play to detect flippers, which means when my player controller first exists, look around the world for flippers. It's going to add them to its arrays, and then when the player presses a button, flip or flop accordingly. I'm going to now hit play, and you can now see that my flippers are going up and down. They're also incredibly slow. So I'm just very quickly going to change that value for flip time, which by default was 0.2. I'm just going to set its default to 0.02 as a quick test. That was probably too quick. We've now got ourselves the basics of a game. I'm really quickly now going to go into my pinball controller, and much like with the left flipper, I'm going to go through and create the right flipper. I'm just going to Control W across that entire function. If you drag right flippers over the top of left flippers, you can actually change it from the left flipper to the right flipper array node. I'm now going to go Input, Right Flipper, and I'm simply going to tell this on pressed and on released, do this. And now, we have ourselves the basics of the game. Again, flip time I'm not entirely happy with, so I'm going to tinker with these numbers and find something good. I advise you to do the same, find something that works best with the environment that you've set up, and we'll go from there.